Hey everyone, before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to share a quick update. Since recording, one of our guests, Roman, has transitioned to a new role at REI. Congratulations, Roman. However, the insights and experiences that he and Jeffrey shared about their creative operations work at Under Armour are still incredibly valuable and relevant. So sit back and enjoy the conversation.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. Why is 911 the default operating mode for creative operations? It doesn't have to be. Welcome to the Creative Ops Podcast. Thank you for joining me as I continue my journey of curiosity of all things creative operations. You ever ask yourself, how often do creative projects go off the rails, leading to fire drills and those frantic Fridays as your team scrambles to pull everything together at the last minute? What if there was a better way? A creative operations approach that flows as smoothly as Apple's global supply chain, all the while being able to track everything like that pizza you ordered, leaving you time to breathe and think strategically as the weekend rolls around. In this episode, we'll take you behind the scenes with Roman Kuebler and Jeffrey Lash, the dynamic duo of creative operations at Under Armour. They share their secret sauce for building a well-oiled creative operations content supply chain from the ground up, one template, one process at a time. What are we going to hear about? Well, we'll hear about why empathy and understanding the pain points of creative teammates is a foundation for developing processes that stick. We'll talk about how to collaboratively create guardrails that give creatives freedom while ensuring brand consistency and quality. We'll dive into strategies for diplomatically influencing partners and earning trust even without formal org chart authority, and the power of chipping away at problems bit by bit to transform how creative and content flows through your supply chain, and so much more. So, if you've ever felt like the lone creative operations wolf trying to wrangle chaos and herd cats, this conversation will leave you armed with practical tactics. I gotta tell you, throughout this episode, I had a bunch of light bulb moments. Some of those insights will be shared on the companion questions and actions episodes, so make sure to keep an eye out for that. For now, sit back and get ready for your own light bulbs to start popping off as you listen to this lively discussion on grassroots creative operations and nailing the left brain, right brain balance with process and creative innovation. Roman and Jeffrey from Under Armour, welcome to the Creative Ops Podcast. So glad that you could both join us today.
Our pleasure. Glad to be here.
Like we start off every episode, and this is the first time I'm actually hosting an episode with two individuals, so we'll see how my hosting and interviewing skills stand up to the challenge. We start off every episode with, what is your definition of creative operations?
Luckily, Jeffrey and I basically share the same brain, so you won't have too much difficulty getting it out of us. So, and when we were thinking about this, when we talked about this, I think it's important to note that as creative operations develops, there becomes a lot of room for multiple sort of definitions, whereas I think people might be trying to drive it towards one thing. What I'm realizing is that there are many relevant and accurate descriptions of creative operations. Mine personally is focused on the part of creative operations that is observable, meaning we base all of our operations and processes and things on observable ways of working and things like that. And so we've always found that that's led us to a creative approach. I think that creative operations is a creative process and a creative way of building processes by observing, ways of working that are already in place.
It sounds very organic in terms of your approach. Jeffrey, why don't you weigh in with your definition of what is creative operations?
Mine is more tangible problem solving and very results driven approach to making your colleagues and teammates' lives better through trial and error, process improvement, and things like that, so that just really smooth the gears of how things flow, how assets flow from different creative teams to others.
Roman, you made the comment about the two of you share one brain. And based on your definitions, I'm almost wondering, is this a left brain, right brain thing? Because what's coming out at me is, Jeffrey, you seem to be taking more the approach of there's a methodology and process to good creative operations. I'm going to guess, you correct me, but based on your definition, you're thinking about the current process. You might be looking for signals and data around what processes might need to be modified or entirely deleted, or new processes that we need. And Roman, it sounds like you're almost taking this observational role, or you're just looking at how people are working. Is this a left brain, right brain thing? Partnership between the two of you in terms of how creative operations works at Under Armour?
Definitely is. We started working together years ago in a non-specific creative operations field. We did production for retail graphics. Growing into the creative operations world, we definitely leaned on our perspective to do so individually, but without the other, we would not have built a complete system. So the way that I viewed it was, how do the creatives create the work? And then I started asking a lot of questions and making a lot of observations. That's how we built folder structures, and that's how we did things like that. That certainly translated into Jeffrey's definition as far as like making lives easier, because it enabled the efficiency of asset flow, workflow, process, in the sense that we provided a framework for teams to understand and create work. And I think that made lives easier, to Jeffrey's point.
Also, like over the years, we've taken on different personas. Roman, you were a bit more of a process hawk, where I was a bit more like a technical solutions point person, and people interacting with the two of us, like we would volley questions and initiatives between the two of us based on what the need was. So we have always had a little bit of a dichotomy in that regard.
Yeah, and this has never come up before because, again, first time I'm having two creative ops folks from the same organization on the call. Usually, it's an individual, really a lone creative operations wolf, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got a bit of a unique situation, and it just so happens you're doing the left brain, right brain thing naturally, and that must be so valuable to have a creative operations partner because, again, most don't. You're both working towards the same goal.
Yep.
But you're able to be each other's devil's advocate. You're wearing different hats at different times. And Jeffrey, as you just said, it might go back and forth in terms of the roles that you play. I am curious, though, in terms of your backgrounds before coming to creative operations, did you each come from like a creative background, more of an operations background? Just take a minute or two each just to give a little bit about how did you come to creative operations?
In fact, our stories are probably fairly similar in that we came through some level of graphic design. I mean, the specifics are a little bit different, but the way I think we got into more sort of formal / corporate work was through print production and large format print production. And Jeffrey hired me 8 years ago to help in basically the print production team. From there, the organization itself started to expand into some other ways of working, and that opened the doors for us to start to apply some of the things that we brought from our other experiences into this world. Luckily for us, I think there was a lot of people who are open to exploring those ideas with us.
If it was just one of you, so Roman, if it was just you, is there somebody, a role in the organization you would naturally seek out as your creative operations partner to be that intellectual, like tennis partner with you to help you figure out how creative operations should function? And Jeffrey, I'll pose the same question to you because for those that are listening, they are the creative operations lone wolf. And I'm sure they would be interested in hearing your response to that question to see, is there somebody they could be turning to in their organizations in terms of a type of role to help complement your thinking and your approach?
So this goes back, I think, to the definition. And I think that there has to be many places that you would go to partner, whether it's with someone whose title is creative operations, and Jeffrey and I working side by side for all these years have had the benefit of that proximity. When we start to think about how we're doing that, that's where we start to really like collaborate, and not just with each other, but again, if you're talking about reaching out into the organization, there were so many places that we did along the way, whether those are video producers. We don't know a lot about video, but we were charged with having to manage video assets. So we had to ask a lot of questions. Same with project management. We build a process, but then we have to ask, does this work for you? That was my process experience. Jeffrey, yours was maybe a little more technical.
Yeah. Right now, the two of us are aligned within our marketing operations. department, and we interface more often than not with project managers. And that skews a lot of our focus and initiatives to tracking assets, dates and gates, and things like that. Right now, we're a little too removed from the creative team and assisting them with their more specific needs and how to build assets, how to build style guides, how to distribute the work and things like that. So there has been a little give and take even amongst where we sit and who we interact with. I'm trying to lean more into that creative space so I can solve some of those types of, how to assist our brain creative team rather than just fulfilling the project manager's initiatives.
We did an episode recently with Amy Tesh Strickland about where does creative operations belong on the org chart. And she's got this point of view that while it depends, her default response would be it belongs in marketing operations. And Jeffrey, as you said, currently creative operations at Under Armour sits within the global marketing operations group. And this came up with feedback I heard from the episode with Amy, where people were like, I can see how that makes sense to be closer to other operations people, to be closer to folks that are part of that go-to-market machine, because ultimately it's marketing that consumes most of the creative content that any organization is producing. But there was this concern that on the org chart, you're no longer embedded with or as close to the creative team, that there starts to be a bit of a disconnect because it's human nature to prioritize the needs of whoever you're closest to. And even though the org chart is just this sort of abstract thing, we still act like in a way that they're our neighbors who are living in the same house if we're located with them on the org chart versus the creative team that is just down the road.
Oh, yeah. So for a long time, we have established our team of production designers that became creative operations. We were there to fulfill a specific role. And it was,
But we were on the creative team as well.
we were initially on the creative team, but we set clear boundaries that we weren't just an arm of creative versioning different options. We were divorced from the concepting and ideation. We were strictly give us the approved creative and we will execute it to multiple sizes and different channels and things like that. So we established a split between the creative realm and the brand creative team and our team of production designers. We became creative operations. And I think that split has just gotten a little too far apart.
This sort of happened during COVID. So on one side of COVID, we were in creative, and on the other side of COVID, we were in marketing ops. So quite literally, we left the building in one position and returned to the building in another. And to your point of who you align with, I mean, it's also who you physically are close to, like who you literally sit next to.
And this is a good segue into the main subject today, which is smart content supply chains. And this is the first episode where we're really talking about content supply chains. I feel like we've been talking about it because I've got this notion that creative work is being split into two meta workflows. One is a production workflow where it's really more about how do we scale the amount of creative content we're putting out there. And two is a storytelling workflow, which maybe that aligns with the way it is at Under Armour today. So I want to talk about content supply chains. We're going to be talking about it on some future episodes. When you think about a content supply chain, what is it? What is a content supply chain at Under Armour? What's its purpose? And if somebody were to stop you in the hallways at Under Armour up high on the org chart and go, hey, I hear you guys are an integral part of putting together our content supply chain. What is it and how does it help us as a business?
I would love for someone to stop and ask me that, to be honest with you. The concept of content supply chain started for me very specifically at Adobe Summit last year when they put a name to this idea of planning, production, and delivery, which was amazing to see. I was speaking at the conference on content supply chain, on the content supply chain that Under Armour had put together, but was unaware that this was going to be one of the leading topics for the entire summit. I was really surprised and validated to see not just that they were getting behind it as an organization and putting some terminology behind it, but that it validated all the work that Jeffrey and myself had done over all of those years leading up to that. Like I have a million workflow charts that we were trying to use to communicate to our partners that this is the way that work flows in general. You need a brief, you start with a concept, you go to your creative approvals, production, delivery, et cetera. And however we framed up that terminology, it really broke down to that very predictable sort of path. Coming back from Adobe Summit with this idea that, okay, now it's got a name, content supply chain. We can use a little bit of what they're using to help us communicate that. And so we started to do that. We started to build the charts and started to build the workflows and the terminology based on planning, production, and delivery. So if somebody were to come up to me, the way that I think that we think about it is that we have a GTM process that has an end. The end of the GTM process we sort of consider is the brief. The brief is what transitions the process into the content supply chain, where the project management team and the sports marketers can get to their planning phase of how they're going to market a product. So getting through that should get them to the point where they decide, here are the assets that we're making, which goes into the creative or the production process. And then that delivery process is really where we exist more specifically as far as receiving that approved creative and then pushing out those templates and the style guides and things like that, which is really our stock and trade. So that's how I would try to frame it up, is it's our post GTM all the way through to the dam. And after the dam, the regions are going to get the work that they're going to put in the store on their websites and things like that. So it's that fully integrated process that happens. And of course, that's a little bit simple for a process that is extremely complex. Having definition, having the ability to ladder back up to planning, production, and delivery, and then be able to break that down into step by steps and teams and people involved has always been helpful in communicating the idea of the content supply chain.
I was just going to add, for me, it felt like drawing a map, literal mapping of planning, production, delivery, and then layer underneath that the teams, tools, technologies used to get from one point to the next point. And then that provided a lot of context in conversations around the office here. People are like, we have these 5-alarm fire drills to get work done, and everyone's trying to shortcut things. And we have a process. The closer we stick to it, the smoother it'll run. It helped ground people in what it is that we do and what we accomplish with the tools that we've set up and the processes that we've stood up.
So let's dig into this. And I want to make sure I understand your overall process at a high level. Somebody comes up with the go-to-market plan. I assume folks in marketing, that then gets turned into a brief that gets submitted to creative. At that point, are there different types of projects? If it's something where, oh, we've done this before and it's really, we just need to take something we did 3 months ago, like a landing page or something like that, make a couple of edits. Does that go down one path, maybe an automation or self-service path, versus, oh, we're releasing a new sneaker or something like that into a new market? So the brief is really high level and we need blank canvas thinking.
Both, right? A lot of the success that Jeffrey and I have had in the field of creative operations, even when we were on the creative team, was understanding that the work that we do is highly repeatable. Again, as we repeated our work over and over and over and over again on the retail team, we started to build in those efficiencies and build our templates and for ourselves and for our own work. And that became the basis of how we approached expanding that to the rest of the team. So for example, when we integrated the digital team into like our style guide and asset production process, we started at the end. Like we went to the website and said, well, what ends up on the website? Well, it's all of these assets. And we built basically an entire menu of assets in situation through a style guide. And then we worked our way back to templatizing that and then to templatizing PSD files. That sort of ability to conceptualize at a high level what we were doing so that everything is sort of running the same. And then basically based on adjustments needed per project, you would go in and use some of them. But ultimately, we've always said we're putting JPEGs on a website.
Right.
And there is not many more than one ways to do it. If we stick to this process of planning it out and producing it through creative approval and taking that creative approval into scaling and production.
So can you talk us through, like, how did you come up with process? Was it thinking about the destination in mind and working backwards, or did you start at the where you were today and documenting how things are done, or was it like sort of a mix of both?
I think we always start at the end and work
Yeah.
our way back.
Uh,
And not just with assets in a window, for example, but it's who is receiving this. We talked about who are our consumers. Well, our consumers are actually our regional teammates who are taking the things that we put on the dam and then maybe adjusting their size and putting them into a store. So we try to put ourselves in the mindset of what does that consumer need and how can we provide them with the tools and materials to make sure that whatever they do produce is on brand, is up to spec, is high quality, and is as would be approved in the same way that our global work was approved.
Myself and Roman were initially on the North America regional execution team. So we were the receivers of global campaign assets and global campaign style guides. And we knew what we could use, and we were often handed what we could, a small flat JPEG, and then build out a store environment with it isn't going to fly. So when we were moved over to the global team, it's like we started first with some simple file requirements. Hey, we need the working files. We need the layered files. We need the source key art. We need it broken apart so that we can manipulate it in multiple sizes, multiple channels. And that's where we started. And then applying it to different elements within retail, and then layering in like digital e-commerce work and the website work and stuff like that. We had a good perspective on what it takes to build out these campaigns at scale. And then we just started chipping away as we were brought upstream into the global teams and then into the marketing ops team.
We're talking about supply chains, and there's this thing running in my head about your content supply chain is almost providing some sort of creative GPS of where do I go now so that I can get to the destination on time, safely, and feeling relatively refreshed and relaxed. And I'm not totally burnt out by the time I get to my final destination. Thinking about going to the end and working backwards, are there any sort of like metrics or signals or things like that that you're looking for as you're thinking about putting in place these different workflows?
I mean, there definitely are metrics and tangible measurables, if you will. I think can take many forms, right? And we do things called kickback conditions where it's like, yeah, we need A, B, C, and D. If we don't get them, but they can be as specific as I need to see green check marks against people's approved workflow. It could be then a little bit more tactical of I need to have all my links of this folder. So there's, again, being in the position of understanding what stops us from moving forward has given us, the perspective that we need to request of other people those specific things that will transition something from a creative approval into a delivery phase, for example.
And do you almost have a checklist for key points along a project?
This has always been a work in progress. A lot of our leaders like to give like a single status for a project. Here's where we are. But in all honesty, every project has 5 or 6 different concurrent work streams, and they're all interdependent. Like the retail work and the digital work are separate, but neither of them can move forward without final approved copy, final retouched imagery, creative approved design work.
Files. Right?
Yeah, the working files and all that stuff. What I've been trying to communicate to our project managers and Workfront admins is we need a multiple status project view on our dashboards that's like project A, we have copy, we have creative approval, we're waiting on retouching, retail's waiting, digital's waiting, and having a 5 status for project A, project B, project C, and so on.
The joke that we have is every time I order a pizza from Papa John's and I see their pizza tracker, I send a screenshot. I send a screenshot to him and I say, this is the best, the most effective creative operations tool I've ever used.
Yeah.
Because it feels like it's this way to track a status along a map or a pathway or something like that.
There is a meme about it somewhere.
We could track our pizza. We could track where our Uber is. And that expectation is there, but it yet hasn't come into the systems that we tend to use in creative operations or most any function in an organization. And we use terms like supply chains, like auto manufacturers have to deal with this, where they're dealing with not tens or dozens or hundreds, maybe even thousands of parts suppliers. And there is an executive, Jeffrey, to your point, he's going like, are those 100 Lexuses going to get to the car lot in North Carolina by next Friday? And they have over time, this didn't happen overnight. It took a lot of effort with folks like yourselves, pull in all the information from those thousands of global part suppliers. And the same thing happens at Apple, which probably has the most sophisticated supply chain in the world. And as every brand from the CEO on down talks about, content is critical to our success. Storytelling is critical to our success. Brand proliferation is critical to our success. Part of our job as a creative operations community is to help them understand the value of a content supply chain and continuing to make them smarter and smarter and smarter, which is going to take a lot of effort and investment.
So I have a question for you, Nish. And the first time I heard it called a content supply chain, I think was within this year. When did you start to hear the term content supply chain and that relationship between the industrial process and the creative process, which, can draw very specific comparisons? And like you said, do you think that that is then going to give us this ability to communicate at a higher level to people who don't need to know the specifics of how you get from A to B, but that there is a supply chain and that there are steps along the way and that here is where we are in those steps?
I can rant on this for like hours on end. I did the first presentation on content supply chain years ago at a Henry Stewart event, and I drew the parallel with auto supply chains. And I said, this is where we need to go. To your point of engaging leadership, I think you're right. We need to stop talking to them about like, oh, we need this new project management system and things like that. They don't care. What they care about is content needs to be on 24/7 and it needs to run like a machine, whether it's production content where we're just doing 1,000 different versions of the same thing, or it's more that blank canvas storytelling content where we're coming out with something new, regardless of which one of those meta workflows it's going down. That's what we need to be talking to leadership about. I think there's a reason why Adobe is focusing on this, because they realize the need for this. And it's going to need investment. Like Papa John's doesn't allow us to know where our pizza is and when it's going to get to us down to the minute without a whole bunch of tech infrastructure behind it and a whole bunch of like nerds thinking through the process. And how do you actually make it simple for somebody to pop open their phone, open up an app and go, oh, my double pepperoni double cheese is going to be here in 30 seconds. I should put some pants on and go to the door. Like similarly, the CMO should be able to open up an app and not be bothered with all the details, but get the relevant information that he or she needs about content supply chain.
This lends itself to like how we positioned ourselves in our organization. We've often described the creative team as they're building the what of creative and the marketing content, and the PMs drive the when and like the dates and gates, and we've positioned ourselves to formulate the how is it built.
The why, the when, and the how. The why is going to be driven by marketing, right? And that broader go-to-market team. Why do we need to do these things? And that's going to be rooted in the business's objectives. The how, I think you're bang on. That is the role of creative operations. Like, how do we get this done in the way that we need to as a business, right? And I think it's not the same for every organization. I think there's brands like Under Armour where storytelling is a big part of it. And the way your creative operations needs to work, how creative gets done is going to be different than, let's say, a brand like Dunkin' Donuts.
Another great creative operation.
You guys have a high storytelling quotient as part of your brand. I don't think something like Dunkin's does. But the when is interesting, right? Which is the role of project managers today or something done by the process. But I actually think that is increasingly going to be baked into the how, because the when often is really hurting cats. And I'm not saying that to diminish the role of project managers. They play such a valuable role. But in a content supply chain, I think at Toyota or Papa John's, I think the supply chain itself and the intelligence built into it figures out a lot of the when. It figures out a lot of the initial when based on go-to-market plans. And once that creative workflow is kicked off, it understands where everything is. Jeffrey, to your earlier point, like for this one project, there's like 4, 5, 6 parts. A smart content supply chain would understand the status of each one of those parts, would be able to look at current resourcing and capacity, the calendar and everything like that, and automatically update the when part of it.
And not only that, and this is something that I say to people is I don't care when. When is not my thing. It can be whenever, as long as we do the how. We have a recommendation for how long it takes, 3 to 5 days. But nobody wants to take 3 to 5 days. They want it in one day. I say, cool, I can do it in one day, but you still have to do the 5 things. And so I 100% agree with you that the how can very much dictate the when. The other thing that I think is really interesting to note, I think with regard to content supply chain, when we're talking about how, is that when we're talking about tech and we're talking about people, like these things are always changing, right? People are changing, tech is always changing, people's focus is always changing. Those maps and content supply chains give us the context that we need to change those on the fly and to conceptualize how we will go about changing them if a team is changing, if a person is changing or something like that. So there's so many opportunities that the concept of the content supply chain allows us to conceptualize. So for example, someone might come up and say, well, when I am briefing in my video work, I need these 36 steps to take place. That involves going from this person to this person, interviewing this person to get their needs, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it feels like a massive sort of undertaking just in that one small area. But if we can help contextualize, okay, I love that. That's great. I love the clarity of what you've identified. Understand that in the content supply chain that fits in a very small area of the end-to-end process. I get that it's essential, but understand that there's something happening before it, and there's a lot of stuff happening behind those 36 steps that you're outlining. So let's get through those steps. The when is going to be determined by how quickly we can get through them, and then let's move on to the things that are coming after it. And the reason that I was asking you those questions, as a correlation, I found it to be a great way to communicate this idea to people who may not naturally be production artists and having these years of experience executing work and things like that.
First, I'd like to go to the how versus when again. This always happens, right? I think with a lot of creative operations leaders and teams, they're focused on both the how and the when. And it tends to be the when that wins out. So corners get cut, steps get passed over, and things like that. But somebody with a big enough title sitting on high in the org chart comes along and says, I need it in a day. How do you sort of mediate that conflict between how and when?
Well, it happens all the time. It is the when that really dictates the end result, because there is a launch date and that needs to be hit. That's business critical, right? We're always operating in response to those. Ultimately, there is interpretation involved in all of this. And I think that that's the reality of it, is that as much as I would like to drive a singular unified process that I can check against my check marks and do all these things, you have to use that as your guideline and then deviate and interpret based on those things, because also everyone has a different perspective, right?
We've also felt 80% of the time versus 20% of the time, the 80-20 rule. Like most of the time things can run to spec, like on process. And then 20% of the time things come out of left field, curveballs, executive, pet projects, things like that. And I always like coming up with these little paradigms of formal versus fluid. The 20% of the time we might have to interpret the rules and be a little more fluid. We also don't want to be process hawks and just like gum up the works. We're not here to make enemies of our teams and cross-functional partners. We're all striving for the same goals. So keeping that top of mind is always critical for me personally.
I think it's really good advice for any of the listeners is that process is a big part of any creative operations leader's role, but it's not process for the sake of process. Ultimately, like delivering great work that makes an impact. And then two is doing it in a way that over time creates healthy collaboration amongst teams and individuals. Very often process ends up becoming this weapon that is used against each other, or it can be. And yeah, it's got to be fluid. We're here to do amazing work. And for us to do amazing work on this one, we're going to have to skip some steps. I want to go now to the two of you in creative operations, sits in global marketing operations, and you're sort of at the end of the line, closer to that destination of where do we want to get to. Talk to us a little bit about how you did that, because the two of you seem to have been able to exert a lot of influence and a lot of change and create that collaboration and cohesion across the process, across multiple teams that don't necessarily have an org chart responsibility to each other.
It helps that the system was being developed and the teams were being conceptualized as Jeffrey and I were integrating with the creative global team, right? So there was this direction that we were going to go from a more sort of modular organization where retail was entirely separated from digital, that we were going to start to bring these things back together from a global perspective. We basically did the same thing that we did in our sort of bubble there. We did start to have access to that next level of teammate who was executing in region. And at the time, because we were doing the North American regions, we started to connect with our EMEA partners, our LATAM partners. And they started to like notice, hey, if we ask these guys for something, they know where to get it. And so then we started to be able to say to our retail partners, well, hey, listen, if you're going to make a window and you're going to work through the creative process, take this template and build it to this size. Because when it comes to me, that's going to make this a lot more streamlined and we're not going to have to approve it. It's going to make things easier. We've always been in the business of providing value to our partners. Our perspective and our understanding of the way that process works is how we've been able to do that.
When we moved to the global creative team proper and started to really chop up how they built style guides, we were like, hey, we're going to create templates for you. Roman and I positioned ourselves as pre-creative and post-creative. In between, you guys go to town. But pre-creative, we're going to give you working file templates of windows, tables, in-wall signs, POP signage, stuff we know that's needed for regional executions that we were just tasked with doing like a few months prior. We're going to give you those templates. Go nuts. So we built them and it eliminated a lot of the guesswork. Like, oh, what's this project? It's all laid out for them. And they're just literally coming up with creative concepting, plugging it into working files. And then post-creative, after those approvals occur, it comes back to Roman and I. We QC the work, we post it to the DAM, the region pick it up, and they're given the style guide pages. And it was very usable on the back end. And then the global creative teams loved it because we were providing very simple templates and frameworks for them to build in.
That's something we've always done fairly well, is identified a problem. And those were problems that we felt very specifically, and then worked our way into a solution. And again, we did it collaborative.
And it became like a very repeatable and scalable standard.
You guys are really singing about the core components of a supply chain. I do have one final question. I wasn't planning on asking this. Both of you have creative operations manager in your title, I believe. We've talked about supply chains. It's the whole purpose of today's episode. Do you think, if you had a choice, do you want your titles to be creative operations managers or creative supply chain managers?
This is an interesting concept because, again, even based on some of the conversations that you're having with other people, I'm seeing creative operations push into the marketing operations space, push towards the project management space, push towards the timeline and budget space. I personally focus a little bit more on that creative half of that. So back to the very first question, what is creative operations? In my mind, people lose the creative part of that, and that there is creativity involved in building process and communicating, and the creativity involved in sort of executing that content supply chain is very important to me. I think it's probably still creative operations. I mean, to be honest, when I tell somebody about content supply chain in this building, their eyes glaze over. So I'm not sure that we're there yet, where we can all collectively talk about a content supply chain. I think that needs to reside here with us, and we need to figure out a better way to communicate that. And that might be the case for creative operations as well. That flexible understanding of what that is might need to reside within us and in a multitude of job titles. So many of these things touch creative operations that I think that was our original point, is that we can have very different ideas of what creative operations is, and they can both be correct. And the viewpoints of the people that you interview every week are all relevant and correct.
To Roman's point, creative ops is such like an emerging discipline. I like the anonymity of it, and I can lean into different pockets here and different initiatives there and still use my knowledge and expertise and skills over the years to continue to solve problems. And I think, like I said at the top, leaning back into assisting the creative team a little bit more than I have been in the last few years is why I don't think I'd want to, have an even more specific job title.
I'd agree with both of you. It's still emerging. It's still undefined, which is one of the purposes of why I'm doing this podcast, is like, what is creative operations and what can it evolve into being? Taking inspiration from other industries that do have supply chains that are fairly sophisticated at this point, I think we are going to see creative operations managers that are tightly tied to the creative team, especially as that marketing machine really starts to rev up. We're almost at time here. One final question that we ask every guest on each episode: is there an individual or a topic you'd like to hear about on upcoming episodes of the podcast?
I'm part of the content advisory board for content supply chain at Adobe, and that's been a great experience. So there's a couple of people on there that I think have some great ideas, and Ephraim Cruz is one, Helen Wallace, who works at Deloitte, both highly visible in the space, and I think they would be great conversations. Ray Barchanier is, on the sort of solutions team there. He's on the sort of conceptual team there. Would love to hear from him about conceptually how they're seeing their tools integrate into the content supply chain. Any concepts or ideas that you can think of that?
Yeah. I mean, content automation, AI. I know some of your podcasts have touched on those topics. There's so much.
We talked about this a little bit, Nish, and I think that we originally had a conversation around like, can we talk about, how you're using AI? And I said, well, we can't, because I'm not, and I don't know how to use it yet, and I'm waiting to figure it out. Eventually, content automation will be heavily dependent on it, but at the moment, it's sort of different than that. So that's an interesting topic. Certainly, content automation versus AI.
Yeah, I'm finally starting to see some organizations do more experimentation, but I would say that today it's a lot more talking and less doing. But it feels like it's going to be little by little by little, and then all of a sudden it's going to explode out in the open in terms of being used in production work. Well, Jeffrey and Roman, I really enjoyed this conversation. We're going to have you back, keep talking about content supply chains, and see where you're at in 6 or 12 months as you continue your grassroots efforts.
Great.
All right, cool.
Thanks so much. Take care.
That's a wrap for today's episode. Remember to please do 3 things. Number 1, head over to creativeops.fm and sign up for that companion newsletter. Number 2, whatever your favorite podcast player is, please hit subscribe. Search for Creative Ops, all one word, Creative Ops Podcast. Make sure you don't miss the next episode. And remember, number 3, this isn't just my journey of curiosity. This is our journey of curiosity about all things creative ops. So if you've got a question or maybe a different perspective about what you heard today, or maybe you just want to share something that you're curious about, drop me a line at nish@creativeops.fm. Thanks so much, and I look forward to catching you at the Creative Ops Water Cooler for next week's episode.